the first treatise and the second treatise by Locke, and we see that according to Wikipedia, at least, the first treatise is focused on the refutation of Sir Robert Filmer, in particular his Patriarcha, which argued that civil society was founded on a divinely sanctioned patriarchalism. Locke proceeds through Filmer's arguments, contesting his proofs from scripture and ridiculing them as senseless, until concluding that no government can be justified by an appeal to the divine right of kings. The second treatise outlines a theory of civil society. Locke begins by describing the state of nature, a picture much more stable than Thomas Hobbes' state of, quote, war of every man against every man, and argues that all men are created equal in the state of nature by God. From this, he goes on to explain the hypothetical rise of property and civilization, in the process explaining that the only legitimate governments are those that have the consent of the people. Therefore, any government that rules without the consent of the people can, in theory, be overthrown. As you're reading this the second time through, does it bring to mind anything that stood out the first time, or is there anything new that you're getting out of this text?
Well, so I just listened, obviously, and I don't want to say it's the second, after, it's probably the 15th time I taught it and read it and reread it repeatedly when I was a kid, looking in it for guidance in a world that I thought was chaotic. You know, I grew up in Detroit amid circumstances that were somewhat dire and bleak. First kid in my family to graduate high school, much less go on to college and beyond. But let's talk about what you just read. So just at the turn of the 17th century, James I of England wrote a book on the divine right of kings. There was a legitimacy crisis in England, much as there is in the United States now. Public institutions didn't have the support of the people. And so James I and the Catholic Church and high Anglicans, and basically just about everybody in England, thought that, God was in control. God created the universe. And as you see in St. Paul's letter to the Romans, chapters 13, 1 through 4, there's a notion that government was created for the good of the people, and that, you should obey a government as divinely ordained. James I took that a little farther and said, if government comes from God and I am government, well, then I've got God's powers. I'm an absolutist, and I can do pretty much whatever I like, and you ought to obey. The English Civil Wars, which were fought in the 1640s and resulted in the beheading of Charles I, challenged the divine right of kings. And Locke wrote thereafter about a different theory of legitimacy. Rather than power flowing top down, it flowed bottom up. Robert Filmer wrote a famous book called Patriarcha, trying to trace political authority all the way back to the book of Genesis. And there is this group of biblical fundamentalists who to this day think the world is only, 4,400 years old, and they've got theories that are based on the Bible as a proof text, the Bible being taken as inerrant, right in every respect. I don't think most of us go quite that far. We look at it as certainly inspired and as something fundamental or something that anchors us in the world, or at least we used to. Locke criticized Filmer and I think destroyed his reasoning in much the same way that Clarence Darrow destroyed the reasoning of William Jennings Bryan's in the Scopes monkey trial in the 1920s in Tennessee. In the second treatise, however, he came up with a different theory of government. And that theory of government was the notion that we initially lived in a state of nature, and a nation in an era without a society, without government. And we created society and government on the basis of agreements, on the basis of contract. And thus government, we are governed by our consent. Now, the state of nature is an anthropological fiction. It takes a village to create a child. And one of the great chicken and the egg stories in philosophic anthropology is what came first, the individual or the group? And, who knows? You take your pick and you choose a perspective and you develop premises and arguments follow. I like the state of nature as a thing that says, don't assume that government is eternal and inevitable. Locke talks about an appeal to heaven, that the people always have a right to resist, but you better win when you make that appeal to heaven, because the sovereign doesn't give up without a fight. So I think here in 21st century America, there's open talk. I saw it this week in the press. Are we on the cusp of a civil war? Well, the answer is maybe we are. There may be warring or contesting views of legitimacy, or more frightening still, there may just be the lack of a shared sense of legitimacy. And the result of that will be no common agreement about what's right. You know, the Roman orator Cicero once said famously that a commonwealth or a republica, a res publica, a public thing, is not any old collection of people. He put it more eloquently than that, but it's a people bound together by common interests and a common conception of right. Do we have that anymore? And how are we going to regain it if we don't, and restore it if it's in jeopardy? So, you know, Locke gives you something to think about.